He mocked her with a Latin phrase no one understood. The waitress translated it and exposed his plan. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. At a high-end restaurant in the heart of Manhattan, a wealthy CEO named Richard sat at a table near the window, sipping his expensive whiskey. He glanced at his watch, irritated, as he awaited his dinner guest. The soft glow of the chandeliers above reflected off the polished marble floor, the room buzzing with the hum of conversations from the city's elite. But Richard wasn't paying attention to any of that. His focus was entirely on the woman who had just arrived at his table. She was a waitress, probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, wearing the standard black uniform of the restaurant. She seemed ordinary enough, just another face in the crowd. Richard's lips curled into a slight smirk as he noticed her approaching. He had been in the business world long enough to know how to deal with people like her. People who had no idea about the high-stakes game he played every day. She came over, her steps light but professional. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice calm and polite, her eyes never meeting his for more than a second. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" Richard leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. "I'll have a glass of your finest scotch," he said, before leaning in slightly, a mischievous glint in his eye. "And tell me, do you speak Latin?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and the waitress blinked, slightly taken aback. Richard chuckled softly, knowing she was probably wondering why he was asking such a strange question. It was all part of his game. He was always testing people, pushing them to their limits, seeing how they would react. The waitress tilted her head slightly, unsure of where this conversation was headed, but kept her professional demeanor intact. "I'm sorry, sir," she replied. Richard smirked and repeated himself slowly. "I said, do you speak Latin? Let me test you. Veni, vidi, vici. Can you translate that for me?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Richard watched her closely, waiting for her to flinch or stumble. He was certain she wouldn't understand, but just in case, he made sure to use the most common Latin phrase. Veni, vidi, vici. It was a phrase used by Julius Caesar to describe his swift victory in battle. To anyone who knew anything about history or languages, it was a classic. The waitress hesitated for only a moment, before meeting his gaze with calm confidence. To Richard's surprise, she smiled and replied, "I came, I saw, I conquered." Richard's eyes widened for a brief moment, then quickly narrowed as he tried to regain his composure. She hadn't just translated it correctly. She'd said it with perfect pronunciation, as if she had known it her whole life. He was taken aback, momentarily unsure of how to react. Was this some sort of joke? Did she actually know Latin? He blinked, quickly recovering from his surprise. "Impressive," he muttered, still unsure of what to make of her. But before he could say anything more, the waitress added, "And if I may, sir, that phrase was used by Caesar to describe his military conquests. But I'm sure you knew that." Richard froze. For a second, he thought he might have imagined it. The young waitress had just corrected him. She knew not only the phrase, but also its context in history. And that's when it hit him. She wasn't just a waitress. There was more to her than met the eye. He leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone suddenly more serious. "My name is Emily," she replied, still maintaining the same calm, professional demeanor. Richard studied her for a moment, his mind racing. She had just exposed a side of him he wasn't used to revealing, his arrogance, his need to control every situation. And now, she had surprised him in a way he hadn't expected. The power dynamic had shifted, and Richard knew it. Emily had just turned the tables on him with a single phrase. She wasn't just some servant in a restaurant. She was someone who had a depth of knowledge that rivaled his own, and she had used it to expose his arrogance. Richard couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for her. This was just the beginning, and he had a feeling he wasn't going to forget her anytime soon. As the evening wore on, Richard couldn't shake the surprise that had gripped him when Emily translated the Latin phrase. He had come to the restaurant expecting an ordinary meal, a business transaction in the form of a dinner meeting. But now, something had shifted. She was just a waitress, yet she had not only understood his challenge, she had turned it back on him with precision and confidence. As he sipped his drink, he couldn't help but wonder who she really was. Her quiet professionalism hid something deeper, something more powerful than the usual faces he encountered in this world of wealth and influence. Richard finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a deliberate motion. Emily had left his table but was still within his sight, moving gracefully between the other tables, serving guests with an almost effortless charm. He watched her, curious. What was her story? He had to know more. When Emily came back to check on him, Richard caught her eye and gestured for her to come closer. She walked over without hesitation, her posture straight and confident. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice still polite, but with an edge of professionalism that made him pause. "You caught me off guard earlier," Richard said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were discussing something confidential. "I didn't expect you to know that phrase. Most people wouldn't." Emily didn't flinch, her expression calm. "I read a lot, sir. History, literature, languages. It's part of my studies." Richard's eyebrows raised slightly. "Studies? I thought you were just a waitress." "I am," she replied, her tone steady. "But there's more to me than just this job." He studied her for a moment. He had to admit, he was intrigued. "Tell me more. What do you study?" Emily hesitated, but then nodded slightly. "I'm studying at a community college for linguistics. I've always been fascinated by languages, especially ancient ones." Richard leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had assumed so many things about her when she first approached his table, and now it was clear he had been wrong. She wasn't just a simple waitress trying to get through the night. She was someone with ambition, someone who had aspirations beyond the restaurant floor. "Linguistics, huh?" he said thoughtfully. "That's impressive. Not many people would have the drive to pursue something like that while working full-time." Emily gave him a small smile, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I didn't always have this job, but sometimes life takes unexpected turns." Richard could feel the weight of her words, though she spoke them softly. He didn't know what it was about her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, something more than just her passion for languages. He didn't like it. It made him uncomfortable, but at the same time, he was fascinated. There was a mystery in her, a depth that he wasn't used to encountering in his world of business and power. "So, Emily," Richard said, leaning forward slightly, "what else do you do besides study languages?" Emily paused before responding. "I'm also learning about financial markets. My goal is to one day work as a financial consultant." Richard's eyes narrowed. "A financial consultant? For someone who works here, that's a bold ambition." Emily's gaze didn't waver. "I know it's unusual, but I've always been good with numbers. It's something I've studied in my free time." Richard's mind was racing again. She had already surprised him once, but now she was speaking about something he knew intimately, finance. He had spent years in the world of high-stakes investments, making millions with sharp calculations and quick thinking. Now, Emily was telling him that she was studying it too. He couldn't help but be intrigued. "I didn't expect that," Richard admitted. "I'd like to see what you can do. Maybe you can help me with a few things." Emily raised an eyebrow, surprised by his sudden interest. "You want my help?" she asked, clearly skeptical. "I do," Richard replied. "But don't get me wrong. This isn't just a favor. I'm always on the lookout for talent. If you can prove yourself, I'll consider bringing you in on some of my more important projects." Emily stood still for a moment, her mind processing his words. "And if I don't prove myself?" Richard's lips curled into a half-smile. "Then you'll go back to being a waitress. But if you do, well, let's just say I have a place for you at my side." Emily's eyes flickered with uncertainty. She had spent years building a life that wasn't based on wealth or power. The idea of joining Richard's world felt foreign, yet the opportunity to truly change her life was right in front of her. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice steady but quiet. Richard nodded, his smile widening. "Take your time. I'll be around." As he watched her walk away, Richard felt a strange sense of anticipation. He had seen something in her that he hadn't expected, and for the first time in a long time, he was genuinely curious. What would Emily do next? As the days passed, Richard couldn't stop thinking about Emily. The more he reflected on their conversation, the more intrigued he became. She wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who knew more than she let on. Someone who had ambition, knowledge, and the drive to go beyond the confines of her current position. And yet, she had chosen to stay in this humble job, hiding behind the veil of normalcy. What was she really after? And what was she hiding? Richard's curiosity gnawed at him, but he had a strategy. He decided to give her time. He didn't want to push her too quickly. After all, people like Emily didn't just open up to anyone. His plan was to offer her a taste of his world, to see how she would react. He wanted to see if she would bite at the opportunity or walk away, like most others who found themselves entangled with him. The next time Emily served him, he was ready. She came to his table as usual, her calm demeanor unchanged, as if their last conversation had never happened. She placed the menu down in front of him, her gaze flickering to his, though she remained composed. "Good evening, sir," she greeted him, the same polite tone she always used. "What can I get for you tonight?" Richard smiled, his thoughts moving quickly. He was no longer the man who saw people as tools or commodities. There was something about Emily that made him reconsider his usual approach. "I think it's time we talked more seriously," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Emily raised an eyebrow, surprised by the shift in his tone. "Sir?" she asked, confusion flickering in her eyes. Richard leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night," he said, keeping his voice even but intentional. "And I've come to the conclusion that you may be more capable than you let on." Emily hesitated for a moment, then folded her arms across her chest, her posture still professional, but her eyes now narrowing slightly. "I told you before, sir, I'm just a waitress. I'm not interested in getting involved in any corporate games or high-stakes decisions." Richard chuckled softly, the sound filled with both admiration and understanding. "I get it, but I'm not offering you a position in my company just yet. I'm offering you something else. A chance to prove your worth, if you're interested." He paused, watching her closely for any sign of hesitation. "I want to see what you can do with a little more responsibility. No pressure, just a chance to show what you're really capable of." Emily looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. She hadn't expected this. For all the talk about ambition and power, Richard was now offering her a taste of something new, something unexpected. She didn't know what to make of it, but she could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked cautiously. Richard smiled, pleased with her directness. "I want you to help me with a few projects. Financial projects. Simple tasks at first, analyzing investments, making recommendations. If you impress me, we can talk about a more formal arrangement." Emily paused. The offer was tempting, but she wasn't sure if it was just another one of Richard's games. She had learned the hard way to be cautious. But this felt different. He wasn't just trying to buy her with a paycheck or a flashy position. There was something genuine in his offer, something that made her wonder if she could really make a difference. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady but guarded. Richard's smile softened. "Take your time, but don't wait too long. I have a feeling you might surprise both of us if you accept." As she walked away, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had thrown out the bait. Now it was up to her to decide whether or not to take it. Over the next few days, Emily found herself thinking more and more about Richard's offer. It wasn't just about the job, it was about what it represented. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was being offered something real. She could stay where she was, in the comfort of the life she had built for herself, or she could take a risk and step into the unknown. It wasn't just about money or status. It was about control over her future, over her destiny. And for someone who had spent years feeling invisible, that idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Eventually, she made her decision. She would take the risk. She would accept Richard's offer and see where it led. She had nothing to lose and everything to gain. When she met with him again, she felt a rush of determination. She was no longer just a waitress, no longer just someone serving food to the rich and powerful. She was someone with the potential to shape her own future. "I've thought about it," she told him, her voice steady and firm. "I'm in, but I want to be clear. This is a chance for me to prove myself, not just to you, but to myself." Richard nodded, impressed by her confidence. "I respect that. Let's see what you can do." As they shook hands, Emily felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This was the beginning of something new, something bigger than she had ever imagined. As the weeks passed, Emily's new role in Richard's world slowly started to take shape. She had been given access to some of the company's financial reports, tasked with analyzing them and providing her insights. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was exactly what she needed to prove herself. Richard had given her a few simple tasks at first: calculating potential investments, evaluating market risks, and reviewing portfolio growth. But with every task, she felt herself growing more and more confident. She realized that the skills she had honed over years of self-study were finally being put to the test, and she was doing well. Richard was impressed, though he said little about it. He was a man of few words, preferring to observe rather than offer praise. But Emily could tell he was watching closely. There were times when he would come by her desk and ask her to explain her findings, his sharp eyes scanning her work with an intensity that made her both nervous and excited. It was the first time in her life that someone with power and influence had shown interest in her abilities. And it wasn't just about the work anymore. She had begun to notice subtle changes in Richard's behavior around her. At first, he had treated her like any other employee, but now there was a tension in the air whenever they interacted. She wasn't sure what to make of it. Was it professional respect, or was it something else? The thoughts swirled in her mind as she sat at her desk one afternoon, reviewing a set of financial projections. She was deep into the numbers when Richard suddenly appeared beside her, his shadow casting over her papers. She looked up, startled. "You've been working late again," Richard said, his tone casual, but with an edge of something more. Emily smiled slightly, adjusting her glasses. "I'm just trying to keep up with the workload. I have a lot to prove." Richard leaned against her desk, his arms crossed. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Emily. I've already seen what you can do." His words, though simple, made her heart race. She had worked hard to get here, but she hadn't expected him to notice her so much. He had been watching her, paying attention to her every move. And now, for the first time, she realized that maybe he saw something in her that she hadn't fully acknowledged herself. He wasn't just giving her tasks to see if she could do them. He was testing her, seeing if she could handle the responsibility. Emily had never been someone who was content with mediocrity. She had always pushed herself, worked harder than everyone around her, and now she was finally getting the chance to prove it. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice steady but with a hint of curiosity. Richard smiled, a small, almost unreadable expression. "Next, we see what you're really capable of," he said. "I have a project that's coming up soon. It's risky, but it could be very rewarding, if you're up for the challenge." Emily felt a surge of adrenaline. She had heard about the high-stakes projects that Richard dealt with, projects that could make or break a company. It was the kind of work that most people could only dream of. And here she was, about to be thrown into the deep end. But Emily wasn't scared. She was ready. "I'm in," she said, her voice firm. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Are you sure? This project will test everything you've learned." Emily nodded. "I'm ready for it." He studied her for a moment, then nodded in approval. "All right, I'll let you know when the details are finalized. But be prepared. This is going to require everything you've got." As Richard walked away, Emily felt a rush of excitement. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when she would finally prove her worth. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just a woman with potential. She was someone with the skills, the intelligence, and the drive to make it in Richard's world. She was ready for the challenge. That night, as Emily left the office, she couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Richard had seen something in her, something more than just the woman who served him food. He had seen her potential, and now, she had to show him that she was more than capable. But as she walked to the subway station, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just the work. Richard had been kind to her, but there was something else. She had felt a shift in their relationship. Something had changed, and for the first time, Emily wondered if maybe Richard saw her as more than just an employee. But she pushed the thought aside. She couldn't afford distractions. She had a job to do, and this was her chance to prove herself, not just to Richard, but to herself. As the project Richard had mentioned started to take shape, Emily couldn't help but feel a rising sense of anticipation mixed with doubt. This was the big opportunity, the one she had worked so hard for. The financial world she had studied in her free time was now colliding with the real, high-stakes environment of Richard's empire. She had proven herself capable in small tasks, but this was going to be different. Richard had given her a project that was important, risky, and had the potential to be both a breakthrough for her and a game-changer for his company. It was a large-scale investment in emerging markets, risky, but with the potential for huge returns. Her task was simple: research the viability of this investment, assess its potential risks, and present her findings. But Emily knew it wasn't as simple as it sounded. The stakes were high, and Richard's reputation was on the line. If she failed, it wouldn't just be a missed opportunity, it would be a public failure. And that was something she couldn't afford. She had spent the last few days buried in data, market reports, financial projections, risk assessments. At night, she worked late, her eyes tired but her mind focused. She couldn't let herself get distracted, not when the pressure was mounting. Richard had been watching her closely, his presence always looming in the background. There were moments when he would walk by her desk, casually glancing over her shoulder at the work she was doing. He never said much, but the way he studied her work made her nervous. It was as if he were silently evaluating her, waiting for a misstep. Emily knew that Richard didn't waste time on people who couldn't deliver. He was a man who demanded excellence, and she couldn't afford to let him down. On the morning of her big presentation, she walked into Richard's office, her heart pounding. The room was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the chaos she felt inside. Richard was sitting behind his desk, his usual calm demeanor in place. His sharp eyes looked up from the papers in front of him as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Emily," he said, his voice steady. "I assume you're ready?" She nodded, forcing herself to stay composed. "Yes, I've prepared everything." She walked over to the screen and began displaying her findings. She walked Richard through the data, pointing out key insights, analyzing the potential risks, and highlighting the strategies that could minimize losses. She had spent hours refining her analysis, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. As she spoke, Richard's gaze never wavered. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer any feedback. He just listened, his sharp eyes scanning the information she was presenting. She could feel the weight of his silence, but she didn't let it throw her off. This was her moment. When she finished, there was a pause. Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. Emily held her breath, waiting for his response. Finally, Richard spoke. "You've done your homework," he said slowly. "This is solid work, Emily." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her chest tighten. He wasn't giving her a full endorsement, but the fact that he hadn't dismissed her work outright felt like a small victory. She couldn't afford to let herself relax just yet. "But," Richard continued, his eyes narrowing slightly, "there's one thing I'm not entirely convinced about." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had prepared for everything, but she hadn't anticipated any real criticism. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Richard paused, studying her for a long moment. "You've done well in your analysis, but you've overlooked one key element, the human factor. We can analyze numbers all day, but in these markets, it's the relationships that make or break the deal. You need to focus on the people, not just the data." Emily felt her pulse quicken. She had been so focused on the financial side of the project that she had overlooked the one thing that could truly make it successful: understanding the people involved. It was a reminder of something she had learned early in her life. Numbers may tell a story, but people write the ending. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "I'll make the necessary adjustments." Richard nodded, but there was something in his eyes that told her this was more than just a critique. "I believe in your potential, Emily," he said. "But remember, this isn't just about the numbers. It's about understanding the bigger picture. If you can do that, you'll prove yourself here. Not just to me, but to yourself." Emily left his office that morning with a renewed sense of purpose. She had thought she understood everything about finance, but Richard had shown her something important. Success in this world wasn't just about numbers. It was about understanding people, how they think, how they act, and how they can influence the outcome of any deal. She spent the next few days reaching out to contacts in the industry, gathering information about the people behind the projects she was analyzing. She focused on building relationships, understanding the human side of the equation. And as she did, she began to see things differently. The data, the reports, the risks, they all started to make sense in a new light. She was no longer just analyzing numbers. She was understanding the people who created those numbers. As the project progressed, Emily's perspective shifted. She began to feel more confident in her role, more secure in her place at the table. Richard had pushed her harder than she had ever been pushed before, but in doing so, he had shown her what she was truly capable of. This wasn't just about finance anymore. It was about understanding the world around her and using that knowledge to create opportunities that would change everything. As Emily delved deeper into the project, she realized that she had reached a critical point in her journey. Richard's words about understanding people rather than just numbers had stuck with her, and now, more than ever, she could see how true they were. The human element was everywhere, even in the coldest financial reports. The next step in the project was a meeting with the stakeholders involved in the investment. Richard had set it up, and it was clear that this was her opportunity to prove herself fully. She couldn't afford to fail, not with the risks, not with the stakes so high. Richard had told her that this meeting would test everything she had learned, and now, as she prepared for it, she understood what he meant. This wasn't just about presenting numbers anymore. It was about making connections, reading the room, and understanding what wasn't being said. She had spent days preparing for the meeting, reviewing the data, and getting a clear grasp of the players involved. She had even arranged informal talks with a few key individuals to understand their motivations, preferences, and personalities. Everything she had learned from Richard, from the project, was coming together in this one meeting. Emily arrived at the conference room early, her nerves barely contained. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that she had borrowed from a colleague, a piece of armor to make her feel more confident. The polished table gleamed under the bright lights, and the chairs were neatly arranged around it, but her focus was on the task ahead. As the door opened and the stakeholders began to filter into the room, Emily couldn't help but notice their reactions as they walked in. Most of them didn't expect her to be sitting at the table. After all, she was just the waitress, right? But here she was, ready to represent the data, ready to guide them through the financial intricacies of the deal. Richard walked in behind them, his usual calm demeanor in place. He nodded to Emily, his eyes briefly meeting hers, as though silently acknowledging her growth. Emily kept her gaze steady, focusing on the task at hand. She couldn't let herself be intimidated. She had worked too hard, learned too much, and now was her time. As the meeting began, she stood up and introduced herself, her voice firm and clear. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Emily Matthews, and I'll be guiding you through today's presentation." The room was quiet, but she could feel the weight of their attention. She had their full focus, for now. She moved through her presentation with precision, showing them the potential return on investment and outlining the risks, just as she had done before. But this time, something was different. She wasn't just talking about numbers. She was speaking to their concerns, anticipating the questions they would ask, and addressing them before they even raised their hands. She could see the way their expressions changed as they followed her logic. They weren't just hearing her numbers, they were seeing the bigger picture. Richard watched her closely from his seat at the head of the table. He had told her that this meeting would challenge her, and he could see that she was rising to the occasion. She wasn't just proving herself to him. She was proving herself to everyone in the room. She was no longer the waitress who had surprised him with her Latin skills. She was a force to be reckoned with, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for her. As Emily moved toward the conclusion of her presentation, one of the stakeholders raised a question. "What about the market fluctuations? How confident are you that this investment will hold up in the face of an economic downer?" Emily paused for a moment, weighing her words. She had prepared for this. "I've taken those factors into account," she said, her voice calm and measured. "While no investment is completely immune to market shifts, I believe that the companies we're considering have a solid foundation. They are positioned in industries that are less vulnerable to external economic pressures. And, by diversifying our approach, we can mitigate the risks significantly." The room was silent for a moment, and then another stakeholder spoke up. "You're suggesting that we take a chance on these emerging markets despite the uncertainty?" Emily nodded confidently. "Yes, but it's a calculated risk. I've built a strategy around it, one that allows us to pivot if necessary, while still positioning us to see a significant return on investment." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, impressed with how she handled the question. She wasn't just reacting, she was anticipating, adjusting, and adapting in real time. This wasn't the Emily he had met when she was serving him food. This was a strategist, a professional. As the meeting came to a close, Richard stood up and addressed the group. "Thank you all for your time today," he said. We'll be in touch regarding the next steps." The stakeholders filed out of the room, their murmurs of approval floating in the air. Emily stayed behind, her mind still buzzing from the meeting. Richard turned to her as the last of the stakeholders left. "You did well today," he said, his tone steady but appreciative. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she didn't let herself relax just yet. "Thank you," she replied. "I'm just getting started." Richard smiled, a rare and genuine expression. "I know, and I'm looking forward to seeing where you take us next." As the door closed behind him, Emily let out a deep breath. She had done it. She had proven herself, not just to Richard, not just to the stakeholders, but to herself. She had earned her place at the table. The days following the meeting felt like a whirlwind. Emily had done it. She had navigated the high-stakes investment meeting with poise and confidence. Richard had been impressed, and the stakeholders seemed on board with her analysis. But even with the small victory, she knew this was just the beginning. There was still much more to prove. The project she had been working on wasn't just a one-time task. It was part of a larger strategy. Richard had told her that if she succeeded in this, there would be more opportunities, bigger risks, and much more responsibility. But he had also made it clear that her success wasn't guaranteed. Emily spent the next few weeks diving even deeper into the world of finance. She had already proven that she could handle the numbers, but now, she needed to prove that she could navigate the complexities of the business world, understanding not just the data, but the people, the deals, and the subtle maneuvers that could make or break a venture. As she sat at her desk one afternoon, Richard approached her, a folder in hand. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious but not unfriendly. Emily looked up, her heart rate quickening. "About what?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "The next phase of the project," Richard said. He placed the folder on her desk. "I've reviewed your work, and you've done well. But now, we need to get more hands-on. I want you to oversee a new venture, an acquisition. It's going to require everything you've got." Emily's mind raced. An acquisition? She had heard Richard mention acquisitions before, but she hadn't expected him to put her in charge of one. "What's the company?" she asked, already flipping through the pages in the folder. "It's a tech firm, growing rapidly, but facing some internal struggles. We've been eyeing it for a while, but now it's time to move," Richard explained. "Your job will be to assess the company's value, negotiate terms, and ensure the acquisition goes smoothly." Emily felt a mixture of excitement and pressure. This was the kind of responsibility she had dreamed of, but it also came with risks, both financial and professional. "Do you think I'm ready for this?" she asked, trying to mask her uncertainty. Richard's eyes softened, just for a moment. "I wouldn't have asked you if I didn't think you were. You've shown me that you have the skills to handle this." The words hit her like a wave, and for the first time since she'd started working with Richard, she felt a deep sense of validation. She wasn't just playing the role of an analyst anymore. She was stepping into a leadership position. As Emily delved into the details of the acquisition, she found herself learning at a rapid pace. She was no longer just reviewing data. She was crafting a strategy, making decisions that would affect the future of the company. The challenge was daunting, but it pushed her to think outside the box, to use every skill she had learned so far, and to develop new ones. She spent countless hours researching the tech firm's history, its leadership, and its potential for growth. She met with Richard regularly to discuss her findings, and while he remained largely silent, during their meetings, she could feel his approval in the way he listened, in the subtle nods and brief comments that indicated he was impressed with her progress. But as the days passed, Emily began to notice a shift in the atmosphere. Richard's demeanor toward her had changed. He was still professional, still demanding, but there was something more in the way he looked at her, something more personal. She couldn't quite place it, but it made her uneasy. One evening, after another long day of meetings and research, Emily sat at her desk, exhausted. She had just started to pack up for the night when Richard appeared at her door. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice a little softer than usual. Emily stood, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone cautious. Richard stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He looked at her for a moment, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "You've done well," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm impressed with your work, Emily. But there's something you should know." Emily frowned. "What is it?" she asked, her mind racing. "This acquisition isn't just about the numbers," Richard continued. It's about control, about influence. The people involved in this deal, they're not just business partners. They're competitors. They're people with their own agendas, their own strategies. And if we're going to pull this off, you'll need to play the game on a different level. Emily swallowed, trying to understand what he meant. What are you asking me to do? Richard's gaze never left hers. I'm asking you to use everything you've learned, not just the numbers, but the people. Read them, understand them, play them. Emily's heart raced. She had always focused on the data, the facts, the hard numbers. Now, Richard was asking her to step into a world of manipulation, of reading between the lines, of using strategy in ways she hadn't considered before. I don't know if I can do that, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Richard stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. You can. I've seen it in you. But you have to decide. Are you willing to play the game? To go beyond just the facts and take control of the situation? Emily stood in silence for a moment, her mind spinning. This wasn't just about being a financial analyst anymore. This was about power, influence, and playing a game that she wasn't sure she was ready for. But as she looked at Richard, she knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. Emily sat alone in her apartment late that night, the soft glow of her desk lamp illuminating the stacks of papers spread out before her. She had been working nonstop for days, trying to absorb every bit of information she could about the acquisition. Richard had given her the green light, but now it felt like the real work was only just beginning. It was no longer about numbers or projections. It was about playing the game. Richard had made it clear. To succeed in this world, she needed to understand more than just the financials. She needed to understand the people, the power dynamics, and how to leverage them. That thought had been gnawing at her ever since their last conversation. Was she ready to step into this world? Was she ready to make the tough choices, even if they meant stepping outside the ethical boundaries she had once firmly believed in? She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. There was no turning back now. The next day, Richard called her into his office. She walked in, her heart beating faster than usual. He was already sitting at his desk, his eyes scanning some papers, but when he saw her, he motioned for her to take a seat. We're moving forward with the acquisition, he said, his voice steady and calm. But we need to finalize the terms. I'm going to need you to handle the negotiations with the board members of the target company. Emily swallowed hard. Negotiations. She had read about them, studied them, but she had never been the one to sit at the table and actually fight for the terms. I'm ready, she said, her voice more confident than she felt. Richard raised an eyebrow, studying her for a moment. Are you sure? This isn't just about numbers anymore. This is about control. You'll need to be sharp, strategic, and unafraid to make tough decisions. Emily nodded, determined. I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. Richard smiled, a hint of approval in his eyes. I'm confident you will. This is your moment, Emily. Don't waste it. As Emily prepared for the negotiations, she reviewed everything she had learned about the company and its leaders. She spent hours going through financial statements, interviewing employees, and understanding the culture of the company. It wasn't just about finding weaknesses. It was about understanding how to play to the board members' egos, their fears, and their desires. As the day of the meeting approached, Emily found herself more focused than ever. She had spent the past few years learning about finance, but now she was learning something far more complex. How to read people, how to manipulate a situation to her advantage. The morning of the meeting arrived, and Emily walked into the conference room with a calm confidence. Richard was already there, sitting at the head of the table. The board members from the target company filed in, all sharp suits and confident expressions. Emily took her seat at the table, a few seats down from Richard, and waited for the meeting to begin. The negotiations were tense from the start. The board members were no fools. They had their own agendas, their own interests to protect. But Emily wasn't intimidated. She had done her homework, and she wasn't about to let them walk all over her. She played her cards carefully, always staying one step ahead, always thinking 2 moves ahead. It wasn't just about the numbers. It was about reading the room, understanding when to push and when to hold back. Richard watched her closely, his eyes never leaving her as she navigated the conversations with ease. He had said it before, this was her moment, and she was proving him right. The meeting stretched on for hours, but Emily held her ground. She never backed down, never wavered in her resolve. And when the final terms were set, when the deal was nearly done, One of the board members tried to pull a fast one, a last-minute change to the agreement that would have benefited them at her expense. Without missing a beat, Emily stood up and called them out. "That wasn't part of the deal," she said, her voice firm, no trace of doubt in her tone. "If you want this deal, it's on our terms, or we walk away." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Richard leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. The board members exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. After a tense moment, they relented. The deal was secured. As the meeting came to a close, Richard stood up and walked over to Emily. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You handled that like a pro." Emily felt a rush of relief wash over her. The deal was done. But more than that, she had done it. She had proven herself, not just to Richard, but to everyone in the room, and to herself. As they left the conference room together, Richard turned to her. "You've earned your place here, Emily," he said. "And this is only the beginning. There's more to come." Emily nodded, her mind already racing ahead. She had done it. But now, she realized, the real work was just beginning. The world she had entered was more complicated than she had ever imagined. It was a world of power, influence, and manipulation. But it was also a world where she could shape her own future, a world where she could take control. And she wasn't about to let anyone, or anything, stand in her way. Emily sat in Richard's office, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on her shoulders. The acquisition had been a success, and the company was now moving forward with new projects, but the work was far from over. Richard had made it clear that this was just the beginning. She had proven herself in the negotiations, but now, she had to step up even more. She had been entrusted with overseeing the implementation of the acquisition, and there was no room for mistakes. The pressure was mounting. As she looked through the files in front of her, her phone buzzed with a message from Richard. He wanted to meet. She closed the files and made her way to his office, her thoughts racing. She had never felt this level of responsibility before, and while she had risen to the occasion so far, part of her couldn't help but wonder if she was truly ready for what came next. When she entered Richard's office, he was already seated, his usual composed demeanor in place. "Have a seat," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. Emily sat down, trying to steady her nerves. "You've done well," Richard began, his tone calm but firm. "The acquisition went smoothly, and the team is moving forward. But we need to talk about the next phase of this project." Emily nodded, her hands resting in her lap, the sense of urgency in Richard's voice making her stomach tighten. "What's the next phase?" she asked. Richard looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "We're taking things global," he said. "We have an opportunity to expand our operations into Europe and Asia. This is where things get tricky. We're talking about major investments, new partnerships, and building relationships in foreign markets." Emily's mind spun as she processed the information. This was no small feat. Expanding internationally would require navigating new regulations, different business practices, and cultural differences. It was a massive responsibility. Richard continued, "I want you to oversee this expansion. You'll be working directly with our international partners and leading negotiations. You'll need to ensure that the acquisitions are handled smoothly and that we build strong relationships abroad. It's a big role, and I'm putting you in charge of it." The words hit her like a ton of bricks. She had gone from being a waitress to handling multi-million-dollar deals, but this was something entirely different. Expanding into international markets wasn't just a challenge, it was a game changer. And Richard was giving her the reins. "Are you sure I'm ready for this?" she asked, the doubt creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to remain confident. Richard looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "You've been more than ready. You've proven yourself time and time again. I trust you with this." The confidence in his voice was both reassuring and intimidating. She had proven herself in the past, but now, she had to step into an even bigger role, with even greater risks. "I won't let you down," she said, her voice steady. Richard smiled slightly, his eyes softening for a brief moment. "I know you won't." As Emily left his office, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility settling in. Expanding into international markets was a huge opportunity, but it also came with risks she hadn't fully grasped. She had already proven that she could handle high-pressure situations, but this was different. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about managing complex relationships, navigating international politics, and understanding cultural nuances. Emily knew this was a test of her skills, her adaptability, and her ability to lead on a global scale. She spent the next few days immersing herself in research, learning about the cultures and regulations of the countries they were targeting. She reached out to experts, set up meetings with potential partners, and began crafting a strategy for the international expansion. It wasn't easy, but the challenge only fueled her determination. Richard had put his faith in her, and she was not about to let him down. As she prepared for her first international meeting, she felt a surge of confidence. She wasn't just the analyst anymore. She was a key player in the company's future. This was her moment to prove that she belonged at the top. When the day of the meeting arrived, Emily was ready. She had done her homework, prepared her strategy, and learned everything she could about the new markets. She stepped into the conference room, her heart pounding but her mind sharp. The stakes were higher than ever, but she knew this was what she had worked for. This was her chance to take control. The meeting was intense. The international partners were skeptical, their questions sharp and probing. But Emily didn't falter. She handled every objection with poise, answering each question with clarity and confidence. She spoke about the long-term vision, about building strong, sustainable relationships, and about the company's commitment to adapting to the new markets. By the end of the meeting, the partners were on board, agreeing to the terms she had set. It was a victory, one that felt like a massive step forward. As the meeting concluded, Richard approached her with a rare smile. "Well done," he said. "I knew you had it in you." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she also knew this was only the beginning. The real work was just starting. As she left the meeting, she realized that she wasn't just playing the game anymore. She was leading it. The days following the successful international partnership were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and constant updates. Emily had proven herself in the negotiations, but now the real test was in executing the plan. Richard had put her in charge, and the pressure was mounting. She was no longer just a key player in the company's expansion. She was the face of it in these new markets. She had to make sure the transition went smoothly, that the partnerships grew, and that the company's reputation was intact across borders. As the weeks went on, Emily worked tirelessly. She coordinated with international teams, handled logistics, and dealt with every problem that arose with a level of professionalism that even surprised her. Richard had been hands-off for the most part, giving her the space to manage the process, but he checked in regularly. His quiet approval was all the validation she needed. However, it was becoming clear that her relationship with Richard was evolving. They had started with a professional distance, but now, after the success of the international project, there was something more, an unspoken understanding, a connection that was undeniable. Emily didn't know how to handle it. She had worked so hard to get to this point, and she couldn't afford to let emotions get in the way. She couldn't afford to let her feelings cloud her judgment. One evening, after another grueling day of work, Emily stayed late at the office. She was reviewing contracts when Richard appeared at her door. His presence filled the room, as it always did. "Still working?" he asked, his voice quiet but warm. Emily looked up, surprised. "I have to finish these contracts before tomorrow's meeting," she explained, trying to focus on the paperwork in front of her. Richard nodded but didn't leave. "You've done well," he said, his tone sincere. "You've really turned things around with this international expansion. I didn't expect it to go so smoothly." Emily felt a flush of pride, but she didn't want to show too much. "It's been a team effort," she replied. "But thank you." Richard stepped closer, leaning against the doorframe. "You've proven that you can handle the pressure. More than that, you've shown that you can lead." "I'm impressed, Emily." She looked up at him, his words settling over her. There was something in his eyes, a depth of emotion that she hadn't seen before, something that made her heart race. "I couldn't have done it without your guidance," she said quietly. "You gave me the chance to prove myself." Richard smiled slightly, but it wasn't his usual smile. There was something more behind it, something softer. "I've always known you had the potential. I just needed to see if you were ready to step up." Emily felt the weight of his words, and in that moment, she realized that they weren't just about the business. They were about something more personal, something that she hadn't allowed herself to consider. She had worked so hard to maintain control, to keep her emotions in check, but now it was becoming clear that Richard's feelings were shifting. She wasn't just a colleague anymore. She was something more, something he valued in ways she hadn't anticipated. As she sat there, processing his words, Richard moved closer. He wasn't standing at the door anymore. He was beside her, his presence overwhelming in a way that made her breath catch. "There's something I've been meaning to say, Emily," he said softly. Emily's heart raced, her mind spinning. She didn't know what to expect, but she couldn't deny that part of her had been waiting for this moment. She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "What is it?" Richard hesitated for a moment, his gaze intense. "You've been a game changer in this company. But more than that, you've changed the way I see things. I've come to respect you, not just as a colleague, but as a person. You've shown me what it means to really trust someone, to rely on them." Emily felt her heart beat faster, but she struggled to keep her composure. "Richard," she started, but he raised a hand to stop her. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not just talking about the work. I'm talking about something deeper. I admire your strength, your determination. You've earned my trust and my respect. And I think you deserve more than just a position in the company. I think you deserve more than just this." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air, unspoken yet clearly understood. She had worked so hard to get to this point, but she had never expected this kind of acknowledgement. She had always kept her personal life separate from her professional life. But now, it was becoming clear that Richard wanted something more. Something that wasn't just about business. She looked up at him, her thoughts racing. Was this the moment when everything would change? Was this the point where she had to choose between her career and her heart? She didn't know, but she felt the weight of the decision bearing down on her. "Richard," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what to say." Richard smiled, his expression tender. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know how much you mean to me, how much you've changed things for me. This isn't just about business, Emily. It's about something real." Emily sat in silence for a moment, her mind racing. Everything was shifting. Her world was no longer just about numbers and deals. It was about something deeper, something more personal, and she didn't know if she was ready for it. But one thing was certain. Her life was about to change, and she had to decide how to navigate the path ahead. The days after Richard's confession felt like a blur for Emily. The weight of his words hung in the air, a constant reminder that her professional life was now intertwined with something much deeper, something personal. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was shifting in ways she hadn't expected. Richard had made it clear that he respected her work, admired her strength, but it was more than that now. It was a connection, one that she hadn't anticipated, and one that left her torn between her emotions and the life she had worked so hard to build. She had spent her entire career focusing on the numbers, the business, the strategy. But now, she was faced with something that had no clear solution, no spreadsheet to guide her through it. As the days went by, she tried to push her feelings aside, focusing on the task at hand. The international expansion was moving forward, and there was still so much to do. Richard had given her full responsibility for overseeing the project, and she was determined not to let anything, including her growing feelings for him, get in the way of that. But despite her best efforts to stay focused, the tension between them only seemed to grow. It was subtle at first, an extra glance when they passed in the hall, a lingering touch when he handed her something. It wasn't overt, but it was there, and Emily couldn't ignore it. She wasn't sure if Richard was aware of the effect he had on her, or if he was just as conflicted as she was. But she knew that something had to change. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was just about business. The more time she spent with Richard, the more she realized that she was falling for him. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't expected to be swept up in something so complicated. But there it was. She was deeply connected to the man who had given her the chance of a lifetime. The man who had helped her break free from the limitations she had placed on herself. But with every passing day, the conflict grew. She had worked so hard to get where she was, to prove herself as a leader in the company. She couldn't risk that for anything, not even for Richard. The next day, as Emily walked into the office, she found herself once again standing outside Richard's door. She had been summoned for another meeting, but this time, she knew it was different. This wasn't about the business anymore. This was about what had been building between them. She knocked softly and waited for his response. "Come in," he called from inside. Emily opened the door, trying to keep her emotions in check. Richard was sitting at his desk, his usual composed demeanor in place. But when he looked up at her, She saw something in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before, a mixture of warmth and uncertainty. She closed the door behind her, taking a deep breath before sitting down across from him. "I called you in to discuss the next steps for the project," Richard began, his voice steady. "But before we get into that, I think we need to have a conversation about what's been happening between us." Emily's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The conversation she had been avoiding, the one she had feared. She opened her mouth to speak, but Richard raised a hand to stop her. "Let me say this first," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I know we've been working closely together, and I can't help but feel that there's something more. I want you to know that I respect you, more than I've respected anyone in this business. You've proven yourself time and time again, and I've come to realize that my feelings for you have grown beyond just admiration." Emily swallowed hard, the words she had been dreading finally coming out in the open. "Richard, I'm not asking you to feel the same way," Richard interrupted, his eyes softening. "I'm not asking you to make a decision now. I just needed to tell you how I feel, because it's important. I don't want anything to get in the way of our work, but I also don't want to keep pretending that there's nothing between us." Emily sat in silence for a moment, processing his words. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't been prepared for it. The tension that had been building between them now felt unbearable. She had spent so much time pushing her feelings aside, focusing only on the work, but now that Richard had spoken, she realized just how deep her emotions went. "Richard," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know how to say this, but I've been feeling the same way. I've tried to ignore it, to focus on the work, but it's hard. You've become so much more than just a boss to me." Richard's expression softened, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm glad you feel the same," he said. "But I understand if you need time to figure things out. We don't have to rush anything." Emily nodded, feeling a weight lift from her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't alone in this. She wasn't the only one struggling to keep everything in balance. "I need some time to think," she said, her voice steady. "I don't want to make any decisions in haste, but I also can't keep pretending that this isn't something real." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "But just know that no matter what, I trust you. And I respect you. That won't change." Emily stood up, feeling a sense of clarity that she hadn't felt in days. "Thank you, Richard. I'll let you know what I decide." As she left his office, Emily couldn't help but feel like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The decision wasn't easy, but at least now, she knew that she wasn't the only one feeling it. The path ahead would be complicated, but for the first time, she felt like she could navigate it, no matter where it led. Emily spent the next few days in a state of quiet reflection. After her conversation with Richard, she knew things were about to change, but the reality of the situation was still sinking in. She had always kept her personal life separate from her professional life, but now, with Richard's admission, the lines were blurring. She didn't know what would happen next, but the truth was clear. She couldn't pretend anymore. The attraction, the connection, it was undeniable. But Emily also knew she had worked too hard to let anything jeopardize her position. She had proven herself time and time again, and now, more than ever, she couldn't afford to be distracted. Yet, as she sat at her desk, going over the latest project reports, her thoughts kept returning to Richard. His words replayed in her mind, and she wondered what it all meant. Did she truly want to pursue something more than business with him, or was she just caught up in the momentum of their shared success? She couldn't ignore the pull she felt, but she also had to be cautious. It wasn't just about emotions, it was about her future. The next morning, Emily was back at the office, determined to keep her focus on the work. The international expansion was still in full swing, and there was much to do. She had a meeting with one of their European partners later that day, and she needed to be prepared. But as she walked into the conference room, she found herself more aware of Richard's presence than ever before. He was already sitting at the head of the table, looking calm and composed as usual. His gaze briefly met hers as she entered, and she felt a spark of something that had nothing to do with business. She sat down, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. Richard began the meeting, discussing the progress of the expansion and the next steps in the project. He was all business, as always, but there was an undercurrent in his words that Emily couldn't ignore. It was subtle, but it was there. The way he looked at her, the way his tone softened when he spoke to her. It made her heart race, but she pushed the feeling aside. She couldn't let it distract her now. The meeting went smoothly, and Emily held her ground. She presented her updates confidently, answering questions with ease. But as the meeting drew to a close, she couldn't help but notice the way Richard looked at her. It wasn't just professional anymore. She could see the admiration in his eyes, and it made her wonder if he was feeling the same pull that she was. As the last of the partners filed out of the room, Richard remained behind. He walked over to Emily, his steps measured but deliberate. "You did well today," he said, his voice low. Emily looked up at him, trying to keep her composure. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel her pulse quicken. Richard paused for a moment, as if considering something. Then, without warning, he spoke again. "Emily, I know we've been dancing around this for a while now, and I can't keep pretending that everything is just business between us. I care about you. I think you know that." The words hit Emily like a wave. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. She felt her breath catch in her throat. "Richard, she started, but he interrupted her, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm not asking for anything right now," he said. "I just need you to know how I feel. The last thing I want is to make this complicated, but I also don't want to hide it anymore. I respect you more than anyone, Emily, and I trust you. That's something that doesn't come easily for me." Emily's heart raced as she processed his words. She had always kept her emotions in check, especially when it came to Richard, but now she realized how much she had been hiding from herself. She had been avoiding her feelings, telling herself that it was just about the work. But now, with Richard's admission, she could no longer deny it. She had feelings for him too, feelings that went beyond business. She wasn't sure what to do with those feelings, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't ignore them any longer. "I don't know what this means for us, Richard," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I need to be honest with you. I felt the same way. I've tried to focus on the work, but it's hard. You've been more than just a mentor to me. You've been someone I respect and trust, and I don't want to lose that." Richard stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, but comforting. "We won't lose it, Emily. We're both in this together, and we'll figure it out. But I don't want to keep pretending that everything is just business. I need you to know how I feel, even if we don't have all the answers right now." Emily nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. She had always known Richard as the strong, composed leader, the one who had shown her how to navigate the world of business. But now, she saw a different side of him, one that was vulnerable, honest, and open about his feelings. And in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to balance their professional lives with their personal connection. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could take on whatever came next. Together. Weeks passed since the conversation in Richard's office, and though their relationship remained professional, there was an unspoken understanding between Emily and Richard. They both carried the weight of their growing connection, trying to balance the personal with the professional, each uncertain of how far they were willing to let things go. The international expansion project had taken off, and the company was thriving. Emily had proven herself time and time again, but now, as the pressure mounted, she couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold. She had achieved so much, but there was still a part of her unsure about where her place was in this rapidly changing world, both at work and with Richard. One evening, after a long day of meetings and reports, Emily stood by the window in her office, looking out over the city. The lights of Manhattan stretched out before her, an endless sea of opportunity. Yet, despite the success, she felt a pang of uncertainty deep inside her. The phone on her desk buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Richard. "Meet me in my office in 10 minutes. We need to discuss the next steps." She quickly grabbed her things and made her way to his office. The moment she entered, Richard looked up from his desk, his usual calm expression betraying nothing of what he was about to say. "Sit down," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. Emily took a seat, her heart racing with curiosity and unease. "There's something I've been thinking about," Richard began, his voice steady but laced with something she couldn't quite place. "The company is doing well. You've helped secure partnerships, led the international expansion, and proved time and time again that you have what it takes to be at the top. But with everything moving so quickly, I think it's time for you to take on a bigger role." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had heard him talk about growth before, but this time, there was an edge to his words that made her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flutter of nervous excitement in her chest. Richard paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I want you to take the reins of the company. I want you to lead it alongside me." The words hit her like a wave, both exhilarating and terrifying. "You mean co-CEO?" she asked, disbelief creeping into her voice. Richard nodded. "Yes. I've seen your potential, Emily. I've seen the way you lead, the way you think. You've earned this." Emily sat in silence, trying to absorb the enormity of what he was saying. A co-CEO. She had worked so hard to get to this point, but she hadn't expected to be offered such a monumental position. She had always seen herself as a leader, but now, Richard was not only acknowledging her success, he was asking her to share in the leadership of the company. "I don't know what to say," she said softly, her thoughts racing. Richard smiled, a rare and genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You don't have to say anything right now, but think about it. This is your chance to take control, to shape the future of this company. You've earned it, and I trust you." Emily felt her heart swell with pride, but also with a deep sense of responsibility. This wasn't just a job, it was a life-changing decision. She had the opportunity to lead alongside Richard, to make the kinds of decisions that could affect the entire company, the entire industry. But with that power came immense pressure. She had proven herself in so many ways already, but this was a different level entirely. "I need some time to think," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Richard nodded, his expression softening. "Of course, take all the time you need. But just know, I wouldn't offer this if I didn't think you were ready." As Emily left Richard's office, she felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had spent her entire career working toward this moment, but now that it was here, she didn't know what to do with it. She had always dreamed of being in charge, of making decisions that mattered, of shaping her own future. But now, with the offer of co-CEO on the table, it felt like a responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready for. The city outside her office window seemed to blur into the distance as she stared out, lost in thought. She had built her career from the ground up, and now, she had a chance to take it even further. But it wasn't just about the career anymore. She had to think about the person she wanted to become, the leader, the partner, the person who would stand beside Richard and make decisions that would shape the future of their company. She had a decision to make, and it was one that would change everything. Could she do it? Could she step into this new role, this new life, without losing herself in the process? As the night stretched on and the city lights flickered below her, Emily knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be hers. And she was ready to take that next step. The journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. In this powerful journey of growth and self-discovery, Emily's story unfolds through touching stories of ambition, relationships, and the challenges of leadership. Her evolution from a waitress to a key player in the business world highlights how perseverance and determination can shape a person's destiny. Through touching stories of unexpected connections, professional struggles, and personal victories, Emily's experiences reflect the path many take when they strive to achieve their dreams. As Emily navigates her new role, she faces internal conflicts and external pressures, ultimately proving her worth in the corporate world. These touching stories offer a deep look at how ambition can fuel success, while also exploring the human connections that make those successes meaningful. Through her journey, Emily not only masters the art of negotiation and strategy, but also learns the importance of balancing professional growth with personal connections. These touching stories are a testament to the power of trust, respect, and determination in overcoming life's challenges. As she faces pivotal decisions, Emily's story shows the impact of understanding people and staying true to oneself, even in the most demanding situations. With every challenge she overcomes, the touching stories continue to unfold, offering a glimpse into the complexity of achieving success while maintaining one's integrity and emotional connections. This journey of leadership, love, and growth is a beautiful reminder of how touching stories can shape the course of a person's life.